Hi everybody, welcome to our presentation. I'm Sadie and my partner for this project is Andrew, and we are going to be talking about complex cognitive processes, which is part of chapter 9. Our assignment was to interview uh, teachers from two different levels and pretty much just ask them questions about decision making, critical thinking, bias, etc. And that's pretty much what's going to happen throughout this presentation. We'll talk about different things from the chapter and talk about our interview questions, how they related to the chapter, and so on. So make sure to check out our Padlet once you finish watching the video, and we have a couple questions for you guys to answer and a couple discussions, and let us know about your thoughts about the video and leave us some comments. Okay, thanks.
I interviewed a second grade teacher at Woodwidge Elementary, Mrs. B, and a sixth grade teacher in Akron, Mrs. F.
And I interviewed two teachers from Minerva Local Schools, which is 30 minutes away from North Canton, a third grade teacher who is in their second year of teaching, and a honors psychology/sociology teacher who has taught for more than 20 years. So Miss C, the third grade teacher, and Mr. G, the high school teacher.
Students will use thinking all of their lives. They will use thinking to beat their siblings at a board game. They can think about how to climb up a big mountain on their next family vacation. Critical thinking teaches students to think reflectively and productively and how to evaluate the evidence. There are many possible ways for teachers to help students critical think. They include ask not only what happened, but also how and why. Ask questions and speculate beyond what you already know to create new ideas and new information. Evaluate and possibly question what other people say rather than immediately accepting it as the truth. I asked Mrs. B and Mrs. F, how have you helped your students improve their critical thinking skills? The first grade teacher responded with, to help my students improve their critical thinking skills, I ask open-ended questions, giving the students a chance to build on their background knowledge, incorporate cooperative learning, and encourage creativity by allowing students to use their imagination. The sixth grade teacher responded with, students seem frequently overwhelmed when asked to critically think on paper. A strategy I use includes simple asking them to either sit and stare at a problem for 30 seconds and then make a statement, or just ask the students to talk about a problem and what first comes to mind with someone around them. Asking them to go straight into a problem that involves critical thinking can turn the students' interest away. Once the students have think time, if needed, I tend to ask open-ended questions, but only to students who appear to need it. If open-ended questions are asked to the whole class, I find that the authenticity of the critical thinking concept is taken away. I also asked Mrs. F, the sixth grade teacher, in the classroom, do you use any type of technology to help improve your students' critical thinking? I use Peer Deck as a technology tool to help students with critical thinking. I can use it to ask open-ended questions as well as use pictures and videos to set the tone of the process. Peer Deck also proves itself to help the students with critical thinking by giving them an anonymous way to let them show off their personal learning styles. For example, they can draw, write, or find imagery evidence from the internet to represent their thinking if needed. I looked up to see what Peer Deck was. It is an interactive presentation tool used to actively engage students in individual and social learning.
So part of critical thinking, a concept to critical thinking is mindfulness. And the book describes mindfulness as being alert, mentally present, and cognitively flexible while going through everyday's life activities and tasks. So mindful students maintain active awareness of the circumstances in their lives. And mindful students create new ideas, are open to new information, and are aware of just more than one perspective. And so, in contrast, we have mindless students who are entrapped in old ideas, engage in automatic behavior, and operate from a single perspective. And so, mindless students become trapped in like this rigid mindset of not taking into account of possible variations in contexts and perspectives. One of the questions I asked during my interview with Mr. G and Mr. C actually was regarding mindful and mindless students. So my question was, what are some situations where you've seen mindfulness or the lack of it with your students? And so then I kind of rephrased it and added, so when you noticed a student was or wasn't alert or mentally present, what were your thoughts and how did you handle students who were sort of stuck? And so Miss C, the third grade teacher, took a second to think of a response. And she says, well, it's difficult because they, the students, haven't matured quite yet. Kids haven't really developed the idea of secondary perspectives yet at the age range that I teach. And so it's hard for them to see why so and so has this idea and why this person doesn't like that idea if the class is working on a group assignment. They find it hard to take a step back. You notice that quickly. A fit will occur about how no one will agree with the student's thoughts. You have to be mindful as a teacher yourself and think from the child's perspective. I have to help them find out why they're frustrated and how the students can work together on assignments as a team. Maybe incorporate everybody's ideas into one. Sometimes that's not even enough and the student will have another fit. And because of this, I have to almost force everyone to take a step back by using breathing techniques and stretching. Those techniques haven't disappointed me yet because it works almost 100% of the time that I've taught in my 2 years. It calms the student down and encourages them to start everything over fresh. And so when I went to ask Mr. G this question, he came up with his answer instantly. I see this a lot after I pass back tests. You can tell when a student is being mindless almost immediately. They don't take advantage of the opportunities I give them to retake a test, or they don't ask questions. I make it so easy for them that I'll even give them the option to meet me after school, and I'll give them the answers to whatever questions they missed. But I still get students who don't do any of that. They get stuck on the idea that they'll just wing it and hopefully they do better the next test. And you know what happens in the next test? They don't do so well. And you know why? Because they didn't learn from their mistakes. And eventually I have to tell them to get their act together or else they're going to flunk my class. And of course I don't actually say that, but it's pretty much what I'm getting at. Mindful students learn and do better. They adapt and it reduces a lot of stress. Mindless students, on the other hand, don't adapt and don't reflect, and that will create some problems.
Decision making is to evaluate alternatives and make choices among them. This helps choose what kind of ice cream you want to have or helps you choose on what ride to go on at an amusement park. I asked Mrs. B, the first grade teacher, do you have any examples of how you apply decision making in your classroom? Mrs. B stated, to assist my students through the decision making process, we go through the steps for responsible decision making. Students are to first stop and think, next consider their choices, then think about the consequences followed by making their decision, and finally review their decisions.
So as we talked about before with decision making, which again is thinking that involves evaluating alternatives and choosing among them, there can be flaws and biases in decision making. And we divide those common flaws into 4 different categories: confirmation bias, belief perseverance, overconfidence bias, and hindsight bias. So if you need to look in our book to see where these biases are listed, it's on 305. So the first bias that the book describes is confirmation bias, which a simple definition for that would be the tendency to search and use information that supports our ideas rather than refutes them. So a student might have an initial belief that a certain approach is going to work. He tests out the approach and finds out that it doesn't work some of the time. He concludes that his approach is right rather than further exploring the fact that in a number of cases it doesn't work. This next definition is It's closely related to confirmation bias, and that's belief perseverance, which is the tendency to hold on to a belief in the face of contradictory evidence. So people have a difficult time of letting go of an idea or a strategy once they have embraced it. Overconfidence bias is the tendency to have more confidence in judgments and decisions than we should have based on probability or past experiences. A good example of this in real life would be like the O.J. Simpson case, where there was so much evidence against him. Everybody believed he was going to be guilty, but the court actually found him not guilty. And so a lot of people used overconfidence bias and had all this evidence. They went with a decision that OJ was guilty, and he actually wasn't found guilty. So that's one of the examples in the book that someone being found guilty on trial is a good example of overconfidence bias. And so finally, we have hindsight bias, which is our tendency to falsely report after the fact that we accurately predicted an event. I feel like this one I can relate a lot to, especially with sports. I That's why I really like the example that the book uses. They talk about baseball season is like, so a lot of people will say that their teams are going to make it. Like, for example, Cleveland Browns, right? With football, and so they actually have a really terrible season, and then someone says in the end, I told you your team wasn't going to have a good season. I feel like everybody has definitely done that once, like won't admit their wrongs. This concept of bias is what led to my question for Mr. G and Miss C. Do you find it easy for your students to make a decision on their own that's truly what they believe is the correct choice? Or do you think bias comes into play too often and whatever decision the student makes is not what they believe is right? Miss C laughed and said, bias is so hard to avoid as a kid. Parents have more of an influence over their kids than you think. I'll say something and then someone will say, well, my mom said, or I told my mom what you said, and she said. So it's to the point where I say something, and no matter what evidence I spit out, what facts I present, the student won't believe me because it's not what their parent or guardian believes in. So it's hard not to get annoyed. It's like talking to a wall. Miss C's response reminded me a lot of belief perseverance, which again is the tendency to hold on to a belief in the face of contradictory evidence. Mr. G, on the other hand, had quite a similar response, surprisingly. Politics have some influence in the world of sociology. Ethnics are just statistics from a sociological perspective. Just the other day, I showed my class a line graph based on the rate of marriage and divorce over the past century. You can't argue with the data that is being given. Marriage has dropped drastically and divorce has increased in recent years, and we can only come up with reasons as to why this is the case, and students will disagree with my reasons, even though it's just an educated guess. This might be because of religion being practiced less, divorce is seen less as a sin, and people just don't see marriage as something important as it was in the 1900s. You have no idea how upsetting this is to most students when I say this. I teach in a community that is conservative and is pretty small, so it's easy to offend someone by accident. I'm just simply, again, stating facts based on evidence.
The next question I asked was, do you do anything to help a student build their creative thinking skills? If so, what? The sixth grade teacher responded by saying, I encourage students to be uncomfortable with not knowing the immediate answer. I say things like, it's okay not to know the answer, we will get there eventually. Such a simple sentence goes a long way in our urban middle school classroom, where our students often do not hear words of encouragement and give up on anything in general fairly quick.
I ended my interview by asking about creativity. I explained the difference between convergent and divergent thinking. Convergent being thinking with the aim of producing only one correct answer, and divergent being thinking with the aim of producing many answers. And so, therefore, my question was, are you only open more to one type of thinking, or do you like to see both sides of thinking? Like, do you prefer one thinking over the other, or do you like to see both? Miss C took a while with her answer. Since I teach multiple subjects throughout the day, I would say I would want to see convergent thinking for subjects like math because the goal is to find a single answer. But I get a student every once in a while who doesn't really understand something and will use divergent thinking to find some kind of solution. So they'll come up with several answers and try to explain to me how they got each answer. And it's so cool just to see their mental process and what they were able to accomplish. Mr. G said, I find divergent thinking fascinating. I'll get someone who uses divergent thinking on a short answer or a question, essay question, and I'll like the way they responded so much, even if it wasn't the answer I was really looking for, but they made such a good point, I'll give them full credit just for their creativity.
Reasoning is logical thinking that uses induction and deduction to reach a conclusion. Inductive reasoning is from specific to the general. Inductive reasoning is when you're given articles about Aristotle's definition of happiness and you're asked to draw conclusions about his definition. Deductive reason is from general to specific. Deductive reasoning is used when you're solving a puzzle or a riddle. I asked both teachers, how do you help students learn about reasoning? The first grade teacher said, to help students learn about reasoning, I encourage decision making. I help them weigh the pros and the cons and then pick the most reasonable option. The sixth grade teacher said, I often tell my students to walk me through their thought process. Verbalizing their thought process to a peer or to me can help with the reasoning process. This is also where open-ended questions come into play. In conclusion, we ended our interview by asking, do you have any proud story moments of teaching critical thinking, reasoning, creative thinking, or decision making? The first grade teacher responded, a proud moment that occurred in my classroom was when my students completed their first STEM challenge. Using only toothpicks, mini marshmallows, and 12 inches of painter's tape, they worked together, planned to create the tall structure, then reflected on their experience and how they could have improved their idea.
We also asked the teachers, what struggles do you have when teaching critical thinking, reasoning, creative thinking, or decision making? They responded by saying, my population of students often give up when times are tough. Inside and outside the classroom, my population of students are often struggling to have their basic needs met. If their basic needs are not met, they are not going to be able to solve higher level thinking questions where critical and reasoning are needed.